When I was younger, I used to think that islands were just chunks of land that floated on top of the water. I thought that the wind was caused by trees moving backwards and forwards. I also thought that the song by Dead or Alive went, "You spin me right round baby, right round like a wrecker." When we're younger, we believe a lot of things that are wrong, but because they are, to our undeveloped minds at the very least, the simplest answers, we accept them to be true. Of course, when you go to school, you start to learn that the way you perceive the world as an infant is not necessarily congruent to the way things truly work. The correct lyric is like a record. Trees move because of the wind and not the other way around. And islands are connected to tectonic masses, and no matter how much you want to be able to swim under them, you cannot. Well, that's not entirely true, as there exist buoyant mats of plant roots and other organic detritus that form truly floating islands with areas of several hectares, that's tens of thousands of square meters. These islands develop buoyancy to the point where they can support not only small forests, but entire villages. There is of course the risk that particularly turbulent weather will destroy the weaker of these islands, which may explain why certain cultures have myths of disappearing land masses. Current educational theory dictates that our understanding of the world around us, and the ideas that we form about how it works, are shaped primarily by the environment in which we grow up. And by the time we collectively arrive at high school, we are being bombarded with messages and information from our teachers, our parents, our peers, the community, and so on. The majority of people are taught, for example, that reproduction is a simple case of the male impregnates the female gives birth to the baby. This, however, is not true for all species. In seahorses, for example, the male has a brood pouch on the forward-facing part of its tail. During mating, instead of the male depositing semen inside the female instead deposits its eggs, up to 1,500, into this brood pouch. The gestation lasts no longer than 45 days, at which point the male gives birth to a brood of, on average, 1,000 fry. After this, they mate again, usually within hours of releasing their previous progeny. On a complete tangent, seahorses are bisexual, and 37% of all sexual encounters of seahorses are same-sex. Teenagers are also taught, during their high school science classes, about the Bohr model of the atom, that is, what everything looks like at the smallest level. We are taught that we are comprised of an immense number of tiny solar systems. Each atom that composes us is itself made up of a positively charged nucleus, surrounded by electrons travelling around said nucleus in circular orbits. This is not true. In fact, we now know that there are several very large flaws in this model. But that doesn't mean that Niels Bohr was himself any less of a brilliant scientist. His hypothesis on the atomic model corrected several mistakes that the Rutherford model before his had open, and were it not for his model, we would not have known about several of the shortcomings it holds. Aside from this, there is a reason that we learn about the solar system atomic model to start with, rather than the currently accepted model. It is a foundation. It is considered easier to teach someone the basic model and then correct their knowledge later on, than it is to teach the correct but more complex model from the get-go. Whilst I don't know whether I agree with this platform, I am not an expert in teaching practices, and so my opinion means naught. There is, though, another reason that we, as a species, impart incomplete, in-between, and incorrect information to our youth. It is what we used to believe when we were collectively younger, when we still thought that monkeys hatched from eggs on mountaintops, and that those who died in battle would fight forevermore. It is tradition to pass down this information before we pass down what came after it. It is, if you will, the academic version of mythology. This is what our ancestors believed, my child, and one day you will teach your children the same. Of course, nowadays we know better. We could never become the mythology of tomorrow. Our answers may not be the simplest, but they are the best. Occam's razor is a principle of reasoning that states that if you have two competing hypotheses that make the same predictions, the simplest of the two is the better. This is definitely applicable for a demonstrable set of situations. For example, if someone asked me what did the most damage to my father's spine, I would hazard that it was the tractor falling on it when he was 19. Similarly, if someone asks whether humanity truly has landed on the moon, or whether it was all an elaborate hoax, one can apply the razor quite rightfully to infer that the simplest and correct answer is that yes, we did land on the moon. We left mirrors there. They reflect light back if you shine it correctly. There are some people, however, who would use the logical principle behind Occam's razor and twist it for their own purposes, applying it in situations where it should not hold true. Arguably fallible statement, they say. It's the simplest explanation, it must be true. Occam's razor, you know. Alas, much like my experiences in the sciences, this time Occam is incorrect. The key concept, after all, behind Occam's razor is that the simplest explanation is usually the correct one. Unfortunately, most people seem hell-bent on confusing usually with always, and herein lies the problem. Perhaps it is best to ditch the razor altogether, lest people consider using it as a proof continuously, rather than as a convenient thinking device. But then, if we did that, it would be so much more difficult to assert statements such as the fact that the US government is actually made up of a series of fleshy people who don't necessarily always have our best interests at heart, but who did, at some stage, get a couple of men onto our lunar satellite. Or that my father's spying will never be the same again. Not since the accident.